Rebecca Knol from East South Australian Council of Mining and Energy. Thanks for speaking with Flow FM today.
No problem at all. Great to speak with you, Rikki.
We've got your pre-budget submission in summary form, and there's some great initiatives in this submission. Could you just speak to us briefly about why you're making a pre-budget submission to the state government?
Yeah, absolutely. So every year, most industry sectors do make pre-budget submissions to government outlining what it is that their members would like to see. But importantly, for South Australia, the resources sector has demonstrated throughout COVID that it's stood strong and it's continued to underpin the state's economy. Just last week, we released another survey of 12 of our operating entities, which indicates that $1 in every 20 in the South Australian economy is actually generated by the resources sector. And from an employment perspective, those 12 companies are supporting over 24,000 people, which is the equivalent of 1 in every 33 South Australian jobs being in the resources sector. So this is a really important sector to the state. And if the state is to grow, if we are to grow as a state, it will be dependent on the growth of the resources sector. So our recent budget sub is calling for projects that will create jobs and wealth for the state. So there's a lot of projects on there which we would see as state building. And the reason for that is we need to grow the resources sector to grow the wealth of South Australia for all the people that live in it, so we can continue to have vibrant communities, schools, roads, hospitals and welfare systems that support the people living in this state.
And there's some great initiatives listed here, which I presume on your website people might be able to get a look at across the whole thing, like regional and remote road maintenance and duplication of the Port Augusta to Whyalla main highway. But I wanted to focus on two that caught my eye out of here. Could you talk to us first of all about the Northern South Australian Productive Water Security Project? You say that this will help reduce reliance on both the Great Artesian Basin and the Murray River. How will that work?
This project is underway, or the idea for this project was pitched to the government early last year as we were coming through COVID and realising that we were going to need economic stimulus projects. But it's not a new project in the sense that this idea has been around for a long time. Essentially, the Gawler Creighton, or the areas where companies like BHP are operating Olympic Dam, these operations or development in that area is ultimately constrained by access to water. And that would be a very familiar cry for your people listening today, for your listeners, knowing that water into these far northern areas is tricky. Potable water, of course, is preferred. So we've got a lot of potential in that Gawler Creighton to really grow the resources sector, but also there is a need in the defence sector. We've got the Woomera area, which is reliant on potable water, and their pipeline needs improvement. So the concept for this project is a desalination plant in the Upper Spencer Gulf with a pipeline through to the north of the state, which would potentially provide potable water to operators in that area. More importantly, it would allow for manufacturing development in the Upper Spencer Gulf, and in terms of reducing reliance on the Great Artesian Basin, that is where water is currently coming from, or from other groundwater sources. And of course, the towns in the Upper Spencer Gulf are utilising water from the Murray River. So a project like this has enormous environmental benefits as well as unlocking economic potential in that far north region.
Some people might say a desalination plant up in that part of the Upper Spencer Gulf, the discharge that would come from that with the highly saline water might not be good for the environment. I take it there's been an assessment of the environmental impact of how you'd manage that?
That would need to occur, obviously, and there's the ways of dealing with hypersaline water. And this type of project, which is said is a nation building or a state building project, would need to have all those factors looked at. There's a number of issues. It's not a project that's going to be built tomorrow, but it has enormous potential for the state if it is built in the future. We also have an oversupply of renewable energy, which has been very much in the media over the last couple of weeks, and that renewable energy could, of course, be used to power a desalination plant as well. So there's many interconnecting pieces with this story.
When you were talking about desalination, is the other challenge is it is energy intensive. You've touched on renewable energy as a way of sometimes powering such a plant, but you've got a nuclear energy roadmap for South Australia as well. I imagine that's something you're contemplating would connect with something like a desal plant to provide energy energy so that could run continuously?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've called for in our pre-budget submission is an energy transition roadmap, and there's a reason for that. At the moment, the industrial sector is actually subsidising renewables. The cost is eye-watering. It's not passed on to domestic users of water. It is only passed on to industrial users, of energy, not water. And that's what we call a threat of under-frequency load shedding. And we've seen that, and it's been, of course, talked about in the media. And it's when the demand for energy is not as high as the input of energy into the system. So we need to look at a transitional roadmap. It's fantastic to pursue renewables. Our sector is, of course, supportive of that. But the state of South Australia has access to other sources of energy as well, and gas is critically important to South Australia. It's absolutely important to South Australia. So just having a single focus on renewables is not, in our opinion, the way that we're going to get there. We need to be agnostic in terms of the type of energy source and then work out how we're going to integrate that. So the roadmap really should consider all forms of available energy, whether it be gas, nuclear, renewables, carbon capture and storage, and the much talked about hydrogen. We can't really afford to put all our eggs in one basket. South Australia require an integrated energy solution if we are going to achieve net zero by 2050. The second part of our budget sub does talk about a roadmap for nuclear. We feel that it is time to have a mature conversation about nuclear. We produce a lot of the world's uranium, and it comes from South Australia, and yet we've been afraid to have a conversation about the use of nuclear in our energy mix. So we feel that the time is right now, and I think it was reported in the paper yesterday that 63% of South Australians do actually support a conversation about nuclear.
And one thing I'm sure you'd be able to clarify for us is some people have said we're a uranium superpower in terms of the amount of uranium South Australia has. Where do we stand, just purely South Australia, let alone the nation, in terms of our uranium reserves?
Yeah, we have got enormous uranium reserves. South Australia is a world-class uranium province. We host 25% of the world's uranium resources and 80% of Australia's uranium. So Olympic Dam is the single largest known uranium deposit in the world and the fourth largest copper mine. It is a key economic contributor to South Australia, bringing in about 118 million in royalties over the past 10 years. The Olympic Dam is well known as a key source of uranium, but we also have other uranium mines in the state, so it is really important for South Australia.
And I saw a really interesting article from, I think it was on the ABC, from quoting an Aboriginal elder saying they felt somehow morally responsible for the Fukushima reactor problem because the uranium had come from their land. I'm not asking you to comment on that, but it does segue into this topic of Fukushima and Chernobyl that is often thrown at conversations about nuclear energy. Does the roadmap address this particular challenge of the problems people have had with reactor failures or natural disasters impacting nuclear?
Of course we would need to, and I think most importantly we need to look at what has changed in the nuclear industry over the last few decades, and what is really being looked at now. I don't think that South Australia or Australia will ever see a plant like Fukushima. We are very unlikely to install that kind of infrastructure. But what is being discussed and is get close to commercialisation is what are called small to modular reactors. So it's a very different type of nuclear power station. It's a bit more of a plug and play where the power station actually just looks like a shipping container and all the rods are contained within it. So it's a very different, the new era of nuclear looks very different to the old era of nuclear. And that's important when we're talking about nuclear energy, is what does nuclear energy look like today? In terms of commercialisation, it is probably unlikely that these SMRs, as we refer to them, or small modular reactors, are going to be commercial before 2028. But as has been reported, we've got a lot of regulatory change that would need to occur to even enable an SMR to be used in Australia.
There's a federal ban in the federal legislation, I think, against any nuclear power plant existing in Australia, if I got that correctly.
You have. And so that's what we're talking about here, is a roadmap would first and foremost need to be looking at the regulatory settings and what needs to change in order for this new progressive technology to be utilised.
Something that is sort of the glamour model of the energy debate at the moment is this grid-scale battery. Some people will be thinking, well, we can do renewable with grid-scale batteries. Lithium and those sorts of resources to create those batteries, how does South Australia place with those sorts of reserves? Do we have a decent amount of that?
We do have a decent amount of critical minerals, but importantly, a lot of our critical minerals are also on land that is considered to be good agricultural land. So that will naturally result in a discussion about farmers want us mining on their land. But yes, we do have fantastic sources of critical minerals. The University of Adelaide has a critical minerals department, and there's a huge amount of research going into that, which is also supported federally, because federally the government is really wanting to shore up and make sure we've got access to our own supplies of those minerals as we move further and further into this technological age.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Rebecca Knol. Thanks for speaking with Flow FM today. Appreciate your time.
Rikki, thanks very much.